Hello, I'm Àngels Miralda. I'm going to record a small presentation for you today. I was supposed to be in Fire Station Artist Residency in the end of March, beginning of April, but this didn't happen for uncontrollable reasons. I've spent this quarantine period between the Azores Islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and actually here in Ireland. I maybe naively thought, oh, maybe it'll all get better and I'll be able to do the residency when it's over. But of course, that wasn't the case. So we can't control that, and so I'm just going along with the government guidelines. But the lucky part is that I'll be in Dublin next year, in 2021. And I'm really looking forward to meet you in person. And the idea of this presentation is that maybe we can do some studio visits online so that I have some kind of introduction and then meet in person next year. So at the end of this, I'll put my email up so that you can send me an email and we can organize a studio visit. I'm going to be doing them until the middle of June or until the beginning of July. Afterwards, I have to go install an exhibition. So I won't have time after that. Okay, I'm going to switch to the screen grab and leave you my email at the end. Hello. I hope this is working. This is recording. So I just wanted to start here giving a little introduction to myself and just to say that I'm quite a international person just because I grew up internationally between here, 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 and I've just continued on that way. So firstly, I should mention that I went to university here in Rome, Italy. And this is kind of the basis and beginnings of my thought on contemporary art and curating. So while in Rome at university, I ended up doing my thesis on arte povera, which you might know here, Pistoletto, Anselmo, Cunelis, Merz. And when I think about it, maybe I wasn't even conscious about it when I did some of my first exhibitions, but this has had a lot of influence in the way that I think about it, and especially when it comes to thinking about materiality, spirituality, and politics. So already a lot of the developments that the poveristi were making pop up again and again in many of my exhibitions. I actually specifically wrote about Germano Celant, rest in peace, who has passed away during this epidemic. But he wrote, in the end of the 60s, notes on a guerrilla war. And in this, I was claiming that he took some theory from the Polish theater director Jerzy Grotowski, who wrote Towards a Poor Theater. And from that, he coined the term poor art, arte povera, but changed the more mystic or spiritual elements of Grotowski's theater theory into a political element within Italian contemporary art. Here you have actually the article, the original article that was published in 69, or 67, apologize. Right, after this I moved from Rome and I went to actually do a PhD in London at the Royal College of Art. And I have to say I didn't have a very good experience with the Royal College of Art, and actually I didn't finish this PhD, but it still is quite important. And there I did write about installation art, and here I have this book that was quite influential for me and my hero, Claire Bishop. Here I kind of added on to what I had written earlier on arte povera and saw those moments, the end of movements and the beginning of a kind of different way that artists individually interacted with the art world. I wanted to write about installation art independent from curatorial discourse and more about how it influenced the way artists work individually in the studio. But there's also a lot of the elements about spirituality, mysticism, and politics involved in the spatial organization of the artwork. One moment. So from there, right, as I said, I didn't actually finish. So I got a job, moved to Berlin, where I met many interesting artists, fellow curators, and from there, the world. So 2 years ago, I started working as an independent curator and have been working internationally, all the way down here, etc. Not here, because I'm Catalan and pro-independence, so I'm censored. But here, because they have the experience of independence, and here as well, that's very interesting. That's where I work mainly. And that's also part of the reason I'm interested in here. So now I'm going to go through a couple of projects that I've done, which have been important for me, and to kind of show some of the progress that I've been working on developing since the beginning. Okay, so I'm going to go through my portfolio. Actually, I'm going to show you the front page. This is available on my website. If you go to the About page, you can download this very portfolio. And it's actually going to go in the reverse order because I have it organized chronologically from the present. So this is the most recent exhibition. All right, I'll start though all the way down here. So I wonder if I can go view. I'm not sure if that's going to be helpful or strange. So I wanted to start with this exhibition, and the soft ground garden was also a constellation. So this was one of my first exhibitions, which I did when I was still living in London, at this gallery that was at the time a project space, Lychee 1. And in here, I was very interested in forming some kind of system within space that would give a kind of allotment or an area dedicated to each artist. Here are a couple of views. And in this image, we can really see how that works. So on the ground are all the works of Salvatore Arancio, who's working a lot with these ceramics, and as well as had this video, which is also in a very strange position here, close to the floor. On another level, we built this kind of table where the ceramics of Mark Essen are located, which we'll have a better view of later on. And then above that, on the wall here, Alexander Singh, a special shelf built for the works of Katrin Hanush, and on the back wall, a mural by Nicholas Johnson. And part of this kind of spatial organization, of course, refers to some of the research and writing that I was doing on installation, on how to kind of make a schematic, and how to organize the space in that way. In the entrance, it's also important to note, I'll skip to the entrance room, you had to pass through this installation of Leonor Serrano Rivas in order to get to the other part of the exhibition. And in this way, also kind of, it made reference to participation and ritual within the exhibition structure. So if you look at a lot of these works, I mean, this one has a very mythological bent with the myth of Mana, the ceramics of Salvatore Arancio, which are just have these gorgeous glazes. And I mean, having studied in Rome and having an interest in history, ceramics continues to be very interesting for me, with all of its connections to ancient culture, to contemporary design today, and also to archaeology. This is also the work of Mark Essen, which you can see these kind of objects that appear broken, but in that way refer also to archaeological finds, and these oversized noses and heads. Katrin Hanush, this whole exhibition was actually about the process of firing, so that's also why ceramic and this metal, I believe it was bronze, there's also a lot of the process of forging, kiln, etc. And actually, yeah, I know it was a bad idea to go into full view, because I wanted to show how I really take the text and its design as an important factor. So this was the text that we had there that was printed on A3, so it was quite a massive kind of poster scale. And yeah, a lot of this, it was quite an interesting writing where I tried to actually start from the volcano, which interestingly remains a very important part of my work, and go from that into the production of metal and ceramic into the kiln. So taking this very earthly and almost spiritual grandeur of the volcano into the process of art making. This first one, Piton de la Fournaise, is one of the most active volcanoes in the world, situated on the island of Réunion in the Indian Ocean. Fluid basaltic lava flows out from the vent and occasionally reaches the sea, resulting in spectacular amounts of steam as molten rock meets the lapping water. So I'm interested in these kinds of environmental conditions and how they create the conditions for artistic production. And that'll feed a lot into future projects. The next kind of major project I wanted to go was Secrets in the Carbon Atom, which was realized in Oslo. And here I worked with several artists more on the idea of organicity and abstract connections to art itself. So again, this kind of the macro, something as large as the universe or as small as an atom, and the connection between industry or the planet and an individual artist's practice in the studio, which can be something very abstract, but in this case comes through in the very bipolarity of the carbon atom. So for instance, this carbon has been used in conspiracy theories to represent both good and evil, the beast and the Christ child, 666, root of all evil, and Ganesha, eternal child of simple wisdom. So it's even in the diamond and graphite, one of the softest materials known to man. The other is the hardest material on Earth. And from there, we used a lot of these kinds of organic components, as well as Emiliano Maggi's mural, which is a kind of homage to witchcraft and gender relations. There was Simona Barbera's amazing sound piece that had to do with how thunder is one of the organic or natural sounds that are able to completely silence the sounds of the urban space. And that was connected to a video about teenage squatters outside of Oslo, and how these kinds of organic, nearly or metaphorically organic components can break through the clutter of urban life. Of course, Nicholas Johnson, who was also in the last exhibition I spoke about, with these very kind of, referencing jungle landscapes, but in a very psychedelic or psychotropic way. Oh, we're a little back in the last one. And Nadine Byrne, who's over here, who, this is actually a triptych dedicated to the relationship with her sister, and her mother, and with rocks that were taken from right outside of the gallery, kind of connecting it in space. And actually for this one very important thing that emerged out of this was a style of writing of the Encyclopedia, and I have to give thank you to Nicholas Johnson, because he was working with Encyclopedia and Glossary before, and it's actually become something that I've done repetitively. So here I credited everyone because we all contributed entries or subjects that we wanted to expand. And of course, this reference to Donna Haraway. Here with a small amount of text referencing the exhibition, and then begins this Encyclopedia Materia Curiosa. So you can see that here the development was a text that accompanies the exhibition that doesn't necessarily speak about it, but which explains concepts, which go around and can add some sort of interpretation to it. And here, for instance, is the actual location that the exhibition took place in, some more philosophical concepts, back to archaeology, and this had the connection to the psychotropic. And then strange anecdotes, like this one of lead, which includes this kind of interesting reference to the early Victorian practice of using lead in makeup, which made the breasts of fashionable women be described as scabrous with inflammation after the reaction. So yeah, there's curiosities and strange things that I like to include in here, because They're small snippets of interesting matter. I think this is also on my website if you're interested in reading the whole thing, or you can email me and I'll send it over. So after this, I wanted to discuss squishy. And also, this one's important to me because, I mean, it's so DIY. I've always just been a kind of, just go and put it together and do it, like totally go-getting. And especially in the early stages of my curatorial career, this is super important because this is basically an artist studio. And we put together this exhibition with several artists, and it's, for me, one of the most successful, interesting ones, and it's not an institution or anything, it's just kind of done because we wanted to. And here I was very interested in the space, so this is a typical kind of Neukölln, South Berlin space with these wood panels that are actually not wood at all, but painted plastic panels, the same with these back here. And so I liked this kind of idea of, again, returning to the organic, like in the last exhibition I spoke about, but the artificial nature of when things are made to look organic. Like this was supposed to be marble, but it's plastic. This is supposed to be mahogany wood, but it's plastic. And this artificial nature that we live among. So for a lot of this, for instance, this is Ita Yoda, and this was, like the name implies, squishy. So if you actually move this, it's a silicon blob that the whole kind of exhibition is based around a kind of bog aesthetics. So if this is an eel or something squishy, something animal-like, then it was presented here almost as something hard as marble, but which would deceive your perception. We had some bog creatures of Joey Holder all up on the sky in the form of a constellation. And Salou Sauvé's piece here, which is really nice, that is a kind of rusted, and he made it kind of spraying water on these rusted parts. So it almost appears like something you could pull out of a bog. And this very nice sculpture by Miriam Lenk, which are these kinds of fantastic creatures that are also kind of bog-like mythological beings, but also which she has a really classical education in sculpture. And so she made these plaster casts, which were meant to be a pagoda. And here, because it didn't end up going anywhere, it just ended up crumbled in her studio. And we thought, how do we assemble this in a way, which is also referencing deterioration and the ruin. And of course, Deborah Del Mar, this was actually an interesting project because she was in the Berlin Biennial with this piece, but at that time it was in part of a green juice bar, which she designed. And it was a kind of funny commentary on a lot of this urban culture of the green juice and like healthy living, and these kinds of plaster casts were actually flower vases. And the reason why I like to have them in this exhibition is because they're actually smeared with a kind of like lemongrass powder or something on these plaster casts. So it has this also very bodily connection with what we ingest and what we believe in health trends, etc. And here, of course, it was put in this absurd way to change it up to make it appropriate for this context. So now I'm already at... this was actually my first institutional exhibition in the Museum of Contemporary Art in Santiago de Chile. And in here, as I started thinking about height as a schematic for artists, if you think back, you can also see that kind of evolving in these previous projects I've mentioned about. And here it really kind of came to an interesting conclusion that was very much influenced by this artist Miguel Soto, who I will work with again, or who I did work with again in the future. And he was making these kinds of core samples from rock and lying them on the ground. And I thought, well, in this space, which is very rectangular, what if we imagined actually height not as verticality, but as horizontality? And so kind of imagine the exhibition as something which is progressing slowly from one side of the room to the other as a core sample. So let's see if I can, this is one side of the room, and so this represents the top of the core sample, this wall, in which plants start to grow. It's where the grass covering is. Then we go through the core sample to here, which is plastics that have been covered by dirt and hidden in the ground, which the artist Alejandro Leonhardt had been actually pulling up and rehabilitating into these structures. And beyond that, this is the other side, beyond that is the mineral elements. So Elizabeth Berman, who has these very finely detailed rocks, which are actually styrofoam. So they're like incredibly light, and this one's actual granite, so it's incredibly tough and weighty. And Alejandra Prieto is working with the lithium, which is actually today one of Chile's main exports, which is of course in phone batteries, and which people ingest in the case of bipolar disorder. So she has a film here which is describing all these effects of lithium, and here the lithium in a phone battery actually displayed. And in the end, there's something which at first glance might appear a kind of sublime Antarctic landscape of ice and snow. It's a photograph by Giuseppe Licari, which is actually of a finished mine in the Ruhr Valley in Germany. So this is actually when they've taken all the elements and there's only discarded waste. So you end up seeing these man-made, of course, pyramids and the tractor going that way. So this exhibition, here's a better image of this that might be nice to see. So this exhibition also, I mean, it's very closely tied to these ideas of mysticism and the political nature of materiality, of where resources are coming from for the artist's practice. So actually, now that we're on here, this piece by Elizabeth Berman, I thought was very telling, because in Santiago de Chile, you're surrounded by the Andes Mountains, and there's such a big presence on the whole urban space, even though you're so separate from them, and many days you can't even see them because of the smog, but after it rains, they're just there, and they're humongous, and they're surrounding you. And Elizabeth Berman saw that the granite, which of course, you know, there's tons of rock around Santiago, but the granite available for construction businesses in Chile was actually coming from China, because it was cheaper to transport it from there than to open a kind of rock mine right next door. And so this kind of global interconnection of things is also very important to me, and how markets distribute and use resources from around the world, and how artists then get involved in that. So after this one, I wanted to go through some projects that have a slightly different bent, because other than materiality and mysticism and politics, I also am quite interested in fiction and narrative, and more recently in science fiction. So I wanted to go through this project Coronation because a lot of these themes start to pop up. And I guess that at this time I was already starting to work a bit more in Central and Eastern Europe, and the kind of science fiction narratives that were starting to be quite influential for me are also of planetary nature, and usually when there's ideas of hopelessness or utopia. So this kind of also polar opposite condition. So in this one, in Coronation, it was also right after Brexit. So a lot of the artists are dealing with that political condition, including this work by Valinia Svoronou, a Greek artist but who lived in London for a very long time, that is filmed inside of a Wetherspoons in London. And she talks about all of the kind of nouveau architecture that's actually coming from the French architects, and how Wetherspoons, this kind of national English symbol of the pub culture that often takes up cultural spaces, architecture, and rehabilitates them into pubs, it actually has this contradiction of an international nationalism. Here's Thomas Yeoman's, a very interesting film that was right next to these flags of imaginary federations or countries. So speaking about this kind of futuristic or sometimes bad, negative, sometimes good science fiction imagination. And here's Sandra Mujinga. These are excellent works that refer directly to Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis, and also to Afrofuturism, which is another example of how science fiction is used to create utopias in kind of environments of hopelessness. So these are actually costumes that are for the hybrid creatures that inhabit Octavia Butler's book. And I have since read a lot of Butler's novels, and they're really incredible because they really tap into contemporary issues. And in Xenogenesis, it's about a kind of an alien species that comes to Earth and wishes to make these hybrids between themselves and human beings, in which then all the human population bands together and forgets about their internal struggles. And it's very nicely lit, and the colors, like this one, for instance, was red and brown normally, but in this kind of color situation, everything melds together into one color combination. And then Beth Collar, who's an artist who worked a lot with monuments. And here, I love this space in Horse and Pony Fine Arts with the kind of wood in the back that we hid with the screen. But Beth Collar was working a lot with these hooded, cloaked men, actually, and how the monument in the urban space defines a lot of our everyday thoughts or everyday thought of power in the city, and how they're often these kinds of cultural symbols or sometimes military symbols. And there's a very nice voiceover over to this one, Spirals of Focus, in which she kind of expresses her thoughts when faced with these men that still inhabit our everyday lives. So from there, the next kind of, I'll come back to this because this is actually a project I did together with various curators, but which was also quite a very nice and influential project for me. But this is one exhibition I did in Prague, Extraplanetary Commitment, where I follow on with these kinds of science fiction ideas. And so I worked with a variety of artists here, talking also, going back to my interest of gravity, right? So we're talking also about height and science fiction. We have this one piece on the floor from Julia Varela, who's also has a film in the back room. These kind of floor-to-ceiling works from Evita Vassilieva, which are really amazing. They're actually latex, and they have these iron balls, and there's a mechanism at the top which is blowing air out. And as it blows the air out, they slowly lift off the floor and stay in this tension, in this moment of tension, until they drop back down. These are also hormones, and I just love the kind of bodily emphasis of this work and the materiality of the concrete. When you think about these kind of snapping plastics on the floor, if someone stepped on one by accident, would create a noise, kind of like a clap. And from that, the sensors inside of the work would switch the color. So there's a kind of momentary shock and surprise when they're changing, that something so material, an object, could be so human. And this wonderful mural from Botan Kerestezi, which again is very interesting because of this mixture of science fiction and the past. So here, I think I have a better image of this mural. Here's like one of the paper works of his that we had in there. But here, for instance, you have a detail of an episode of Black Mirror, which of course is referencing science fiction. But on the other side, I guess you can only see it here, these are actually some peasants from a mural of Giotto. So something that's kind of referencing the history of art, and then something very much about the future. I like this parallel between the historic and that which has not yet happened. Oh, and here's Adminoliti, who's also kind of imagining these worlds in which characters inhabit a space in which issues of gender, of race of class have all disappeared, going back to the utopias of modernist artists who imagined, for instance, the cube or the abstract shapes could achieve a total equality. And these are a series of fantastical landscapes. Here, one image of Julia Varela's film. Also, because she's the one on the floor, this is, she works a lot with the image and how the image is embodied, that we often imagine the digital image as an immaterialized object, and yet it requires screen, it requires projector, it requires constant energy and light in order to manifest it, and that these often reflect what the purpose of this image is. So here, this powder that was on the floor is actually crushed up television screens, which then actors put onto their bodies and became kind of these techno-biological landscapes, which are here filmed. Okay, so those two were kind of going onto this science fiction hinge, and I wanted to skip up to this one exhibition which I did last summer in Croatia, because, again, this is the exhibition that I worked with Miguel Soto once more, and several other artists, also Alejandra Prieto, she was in the exhibition in Chile. And this one is also very much material, but also taking a much more political term. So I worked with Ana Alenso, for instance, who makes these marvelous installations. And everything in here, nothing, well, this was shipped, but because it fits, it's small. But the rest were found in the Zagreb Recycling Center. And I just remember going in there and Anna picking out all of these objects from there to make the installation. And here she was referencing, she wanted objects that could represent a political struggle that happened off the island of Krk in Croatia, in which an offshore platform was meant to be built, but then it never was. And actually it was stopped by activists who were really asking, to stop this from happening, and laws were passed to enable it and everything, and they actually won. So she went and talked with some of the characters who were involved, or not characters, but personalities who were kind of on the forefront of this struggle. And the installation is about the canisters of oil floating on the bottles of water. A lot of these kinds of industrial aesthetics, which show the precarity of nature among this mess that we've created. And so this work, it was really fantastic because it's combining all these interests. Gravity, the materiality of the water, industry, the balance between these, and all of it reflected in the artist's work. And then there was a screening of films that I wanted to kind of add an international element and some kind of view from other parts of the world. And then there was Miguel Soto's sculpture here, which, funnily enough, we had already discussed this in Chile where we met, but he actually comes from a family that arrived to Chile from Croatia. So I wanted to invite him here to talk about materiality and heritage. So these rocks are the core samples that I mentioned earlier that were influential to the exhibition in Chile. And they were actually produced because his grandmother received some land in Croatia, and she dug them up to see if there was any profit to be made from mining or extracting from that land. And there was not. And today, the area where that land is quite a kind of beautiful touristic island. But the kind of main story about these were the struggle to get these rock samples into Chile as a family heirloom, in which there's a quite strict law about what you can bring in and out, and rocks are kind of very difficult. So luckily we didn't have to transport them back from Chile and but he got these actually from the actual land. And they were actually wrapped to create a heater. So this was also a kind of comment on this polarity of the northern and southern hemisphere. So this exhibition opened in the summer in Croatia. It was extremely hot and this heater was on. And for him, of course, in Chile, it's winter. So talking about this idea of heritage and opposites and how these kinds of hemispheres lack understanding for each other. Okay, so from there, I think that I can go back to Survival Kit, which was a festival that I co-curated together with Solita Kreze and Galatse Sharma in Riga, in Latvia. And Survival Kit is a festival which originally started 2008, as a response to the crisis, taking over disused spaces and shop fronts in Riga and kind of offering them to artists to use. So it has this kind of also quite a punk initial starting point, which eventually became very professionalized. And for this event, for instance, we got some funding from Goethe Institute, so we were able to invite many artists from Germany. And we really took the site that was chosen that year as the beginning of the narrative, which was an unused circus, which had been closed off for over 10 years. And it was actually closed due to many things, but among them for the treatment of animals, which was going on there. There was elephants living in Latvia, which is kind of unnatural, and the conditions need to be really well prepared. So in this case, I believe they weren't. And so this was, there's many projects I can speak about here, but for instance, Sibeli Cavalli-Bastos made this kind of interior that's almost as if you're after a party. Something has occurred, and there's the remains. And this was accompanied by a soundtrack which kind of explained this science fiction scenario. And all the blacklight here was amazing because you can't see it in the image, but on the other side were the original 1980s portraits of the circus participants and actors. And for the first time since then, they were in the blacklight, and you could see all the blacklight paint. And here's actually the main arena of the circus, in which there were also performances. And here, one of the rooms. There was a big focus on animals, actually. So you see dogs cropping up here in Krislan Salu's wonderful ceramics, as well as Anastasia Sosunova's film of the Demikov dog, in which actually recounts a Soviet experiment. So in this situation of the circus, which had dealt with how animals are inside, you're also having this example of the dogs as medical experiment and how we've progressed since then. Here also Cassius Padlabi, who also made an homage to Laika, and actually is making quite a strong case for interspecies solidarity. So he's talking about, it's called Tirelur Senegalese, which references the Senegalese soldiers, which were actually taken to fight for France and were basically put on the front line as human sacrifices, in order to draw out the enemy to be able to kill them. And so Laika similarly was shot out into space and never returned. Here we also have quite an extensive public program, but this was actually the first part of a 2-part edition because it was the 10th year anniversary. So that's why they're not together in my portfolio. But so I returned the following spring to finish this kind of edition 10.1, and with a longer and different list of artists, but also in which I wrote this text, which has, strangely enough, led to many more texts, and also goes back to Arte Povera with Janis Kunelis, but ties Kunelis in with the context of the Soviet Union and his obsession with Kazimir Malevich. And thinking about perspective and so on was part of this exhibition, the second part of this exhibition. So for instance here, Adrian Melis, Covert Planning is a wonderful project where he talks about his grandmother in Cuba and how she survived the special phase of the 90s. And of course, if you think about a special phase of the 90s, all the Baltic countries at the same time were experiencing something similar. because the way of life they knew had completely collapsed. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost its main trade partner. And so a lot of life changed there, even though they continued in the communist regime. So yeah, there were many, many projects with Nastasia Sosunova again, this time with a film about the Russian Orthodox community in Lithuania. And again with Kasia Svadlabi. And this time, of course, I mean, this was at the moment just after the protests in Sudan, so this is also a kind of, not a memorial, but maybe a homage to the people fighting there. Okay, so I wanted to simply end with one last project, as I don't have time to talk about every single one of them. But this is a project that I did in the Azores Islands. So maybe I can go back to my little map, because this is a nice place to do a project in. It's just here, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. This was also where I spent the first part of my coronavirus quarantine, on the island of São Miguel. So this project was actually a residency done with REACT, which is a festival done on the island of Terceira once a year. I worked together with the curator Irene Campolmi and invited 3 artists to take part in the residency. And this is a residency that deals a lot with nature and technology and the intersection of those. So we invited artists specifically that have worked with those issues before and which have worked on islands, so that we could think of a kind of planetary thinking of island thinking. The idea was that each of them would show a film which they had made in the past, as well as conduct research to influence future projects. So these are actually the films that we showed in the exhibition. There were so many very nice connections between all the artists who were interested in extreme life forms, but also in endangered life forms. And I mean, islands all over the world. This is Deception Island in the South Atlantic Ocean, almost near Antarctica. Paul Rosero Contreras is from Ecuador and works a lot in the Galapagos Islands, another volcanic archipelago similar to the Azores, but a different ocean. And Jakob Kurstensen, who makes these animations which are actually rewilding extinct animals. Of course, it's impossible, because rewilding is about reintroducing animals into the wild which are only in captivity. And he uses the animation, also in a kind of science fiction way, in order to rehabilitate extinct species and reintroduce them into this wild digital world. And so I wanted to specifically mention this project because I so far had not done much work outside of architecture. And in this case, we did a performance inside of this cave, the Algar do Carvalho. And I think this is another kind of starting point for me. It's something I've been thinking a lot about, how to do these kinds of site-specific performances in which the site kind of narrates its own vision and artists respond to it. So this is it's one of 2 places in the world in which a volcanic eruption actually created the cave by trying to bore out a hole and go out into the atmosphere, but on hitting a harder rock surface went another way and left a cavern, and inside is a lagoon. So in here, there was actually, here's Paul and Jakob playing, so there was sound performances from all 3 artists, and it was just amazing because of the acoustics, and many of them, of course, use some sound from animals in the wild, and so to transport animals from, Jakob had a very nice piece that was about actually animals living in Hyde Park in London, one of the most kind of urban parks. And Paul had some from the deep ocean, and to bring them into this very unique space, this cave in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, was something quite special. And of course, location for me is very important. So that was a very symbolic act for me. So this is all I'm going to say about my past projects, and just briefly to this strange time of quarantine is still quite busy for me. So I'll just show, right now in Ljubljana in Slovenia, I just have opened this exhibition. It's a solo exhibition from Andrej Škufca called Black Market, which is amazing because I met with Andrej already kind of thinking about this exhibition. We had so much to talk about because he's specifically talking about science fiction and sculptural materiality. It's an amazing exhibition. I'll just go quickly through some of the photographs. So it's really kind of using all the architectural space, having this amazing kind of techno-biological corpus, interacting with the architecture and changing the path of the spectator through the exhibition concourse and interrupting it. So for this, I also made a small glossary, which accompanies it with lots of the material techniques that he's using, the science fiction narratives, kind of saying a bit about the plots that inform it, as well as theories that influence it. And in here also important is a kind of family tree of Slovenian artists that are references for Andrej Škufca, and among them is Malevich, going back to the Arte Povera Janus Canellas connection. This is an incredible, suspended in air. And important here was also, because Andrej Škufca has for a long time been a co-editor of Šum magazine, which is quite known in Balkans and beyond for being a very experimental theory, fiction, and art magazine. And so this is an important exhibition because it's really showing his material side practice, but accompanied by an amazing catalogue with new contributions from some of the authors, from Šum and others. Here's the glossary that I've created as a little preparation room for entering the exhibition. And in July, I have this exhibition about to open at the Tallinn Art Hall in Estonia. And this is also taking, it's something that for me is very interesting. It's how we as contemporary artists or curators relate to heritage and the past. So in Estonia, I'm working with the artist Olev Subi and his career as one of those artists that was very popular in the Soviet era, but then was somehow left aside by historians in the 1990s. And a lot of the work today is actually on recuperating these histories that were often discarded as, people really wanted a severe break. And Olev Subi, the end of times, he was always out of time. He was exiled in Siberia for 8 years and therefore started art school with artists who were already 10 years younger than him. And this trend of being out of times continued in the 1990s. When artists were adopting all of the kind of Western rhetoric of contemporary art, he worked in a completely Soviet way of the relationship between art and the state, actually he became an exhibition designer of Estonian painters and worked closely with Lennart Meri, the first president of the independent Estonia. So I've invited 7 contemporary artists to kind of react to Subi's work. And among that, again, Larry Echiampong is also bringing up Afrofuturism. Maria Dahlberg has also these mind structures of how nature affects mentality. Nona Nescu, who relates the body to earth. Admin Aliti, who I worked with in the past, who's making these abstract characters that inhabit this utopian reality. Juana Subercazo and Nazim Yunal Yilmaz are both painters. And Juana more focused on landscape and the sublime, and Nazim Yunal Yilmaz more on the subject, which are the two kind of cruxes of Subi's work. And Maya Watanabe, who has a wonderful film, Liminal, about how we're passed down history and how it's hidden and how it can be recuperated. And a very painterly film at that. Okay, and that's it. After this, next year I'm going to be part of the DApple curatorial program, which I'm very excited about because it'll give me an opportunity to research some of these issues, and I'm very interested now in thinking about the ethics of sight. So taking off from this project in the Azores, thinking about locality, territoriality, but also a lot of these problematics with heritage and local histories in an international sphere will also inform a lot of what I'm going to work on. So I'm super excited to join this very prestigious family of curators who have done very nice work before. Thank you for listening to my long presentation. Okay, thank you for listening to my long presentation. I'm just going to put my email on the screen. If you feel like you have some connection or want to chat and have a studio visit, I'm happy to do those in June, not in July. I'll be installing an exhibition, so we can organize the studio visit then. See you soon. Looking forward to meet you in 2021.